December 18th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The coldest winter in living memory had turned the woods into a labyrinth of white shadows and frozen silence. Snow gathered in drifts along the narrow roads. Fog clung to the pines like a shroud. And somewhere deep in that quiet, out of sight, out of reach, an entire German army was beginning to move. But the men of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, didn't know that yet. To them, the war on that morning felt almost routine. The sun hadn't risen, but the tank crews were already awake, warming their hands near the engine exhausts, checking their gear, tightening straps on ammunition racks. 5 Shermans made up the platoon, steel giants coated in frost, engines humming like beasts waiting to be unleashed. Inside each tank, the same rhythm played out, rifles checked, radios tested, jokes exchanged to hide the tension. No one wanted to admit they felt something strange in the air. Lieutenant Harris stood in his turret scanning the tree line. His instincts were screaming, whispering that the forest was wrong, too quiet, too still. But orders were orders. At 7:30, the column rolled out. Treads cracked frozen mud. Branches snapped under the weight of armor. The 5-tank line moved through the dense, twisting roads, disappearing into the white fog like ghosts. The platoon had a simple mission: push east, clear a supply route, link with infantry moving behind them. Nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, at least according to the map. But the map didn't know the Germans had launched the largest surprise offensive of the war less than 12 hours earlier. The map didn't know the 37th Tank Battalion was driving straight into the teeth of the German advance. And the map didn't know that 4 of the 5 tanks would never make it back. Inside the lead tank, the crew spoke softly, half to stay focused, half to warm themselves. "Cold enough to freeze a rifle shut," the loader muttered. "At least we're moving," the driver replied. No one laughed. At 9:40, they reached a tight bend in the road. At 9:41, the forest erupted. A German artillery observer, hidden high in a tree, had been tracking them since dawn. When the tanks entered the kill zone, he gave the signal. The first shell hit the road in front of the lead Sherman, blasting dirt and metal into a cloud. The second shell hit the second tank directly. Fire sprayed from the engine deck. The turret snapped sideways, and the crew bailed out into the snow under machine gun fire. Radio calls exploded inside the helmets of the remaining crews. "Contact! Contact! Contact! Take cover! Artillery! Left side! Move! Move! Move!" But there was nowhere to move. More shells rained down. Trees exploded in showers of splinters. The road behind them collapsed under a barrage, cut off. Tank number 3 took a near-direct hit. It lurched sideways, tracks mangled, turret jammed. Smoke filled the hull. The driver coughed, choking, before the commander ordered everyone out. Tank number 4 tried to reverse, its engine screaming as it pushed against the icy ground. But German infantry appeared from the tree line, launching Panzerfausts. One rocket slammed into the rear plate, turning the tank into a burning furnace. The crew scattered through the smoke. Within minutes, the platoon was nearly gone. Only 2 tanks remained, Tank number 2 and Tank number 5. Tank number 2 backed toward a clearing, but German riflemen were already closing in. A shot rang out, then another. A Panzerfaust streaked across the woods and hit the side of the turret. The explosion sent shrapnel roaring through the interior. The crew escaped, but the tank was done. That left only one. Tank number 5, Sherman M4A3, call sign, Anvil. Inside were 5 men: Staff Sergeant William Carter, tank commander; PFC Daniels, driver; Corporal Beck, gunner; Private Ortiz, loader; Technician Frank Howell, radio operator. They were bruised, shaken, half blinded by dust and smoke, but alive. Carter looked through his periscope. He saw no friendly tanks. He saw no infantry. He saw only flames, shattered trees, smoke, and German soldiers moving between the pines like shadows. Howell twisted the radio dial desperately. Nothing but static. Either their antenna was damaged, or the entire battalion was being jammed or overwhelmed. The forest felt like it was closing in. Daniels whispered, "Where's the rest of the platoon?" Carter swallowed hard. In his gut, he already knew the truth. "They're gone," he said quietly. "We're the last one moving." Silence filled the tank. Then a burst of MG-42 fire ripped across the hull. "Drive!" Carter shouted. Daniels slammed the throttle. The Sherman lurched forward, treads throwing up snow. Behind them, German infantry swarmed the wrecks of the other tanks, searching for survivors or supplies. Ahead, only fog and forest stretched into darkness. Carter grabbed the radio handset, even though he knew it was useless. "Any friendly units? This is Anvil 5. Tank platoon destroyed.
They were alone, a single American tank deep behind German lines with no map of enemy positions, no infantry support, no clear escape route. The Germans weren't expecting a lone Sherman roaming the forest, but they would adapt quickly. The crew knew it. Carter made a decision. "We're heading south," he said. "Try to cross back behind their lines. If we stay here, they'll close the trap." Beck loaded a fresh shell. Ortiz sat ready with ammunition. Daniels gripped the controls. Howell listened desperately for any radio signal. And slowly, through fog and falling snow, Tank 5 disappeared deeper into the forest. Not because it wanted to, but because there was no other choice. They didn't know it yet, but the next 24 hours would turn this lone Sherman into one of the most incredible survival stories of the war. The forest swallowed the Sherman as it pushed south, engine growling low to avoid detection. Inside, the crew barely spoke. Every man understood the same truth. They were deep in enemy territory, without radio contact, without a clear route, and without any guarantee that friendly forces still held the lines they were trying to reach. Snow fell harder, blanketing the tank's hull in a layer of white. It dampened sound, muffled the engine, softened the crunch of treads. A blessing at least for the moment. Daniels kept the tank slow, weaving between trees so close the turret almost scraped bark. Visibility was nearly zero. Beck whispered from the gunner's seat, "If they hear us, they'll bring up a pack gun. One hit to the front plate and it's over." Carter didn't argue. He knew the forests were crawling with German anti-tank teams. The surprise offensive had thrown the front wide open. Roads the Americans thought were safe were now controlled by enemy patrols, panzers, and makeshift roadblocks. Every turn could lead to a kill zone. At 12:50, Howell stiffened. "Commander, I think I'm hearing something." They stopped instantly. The engine dropped to idle. Voices. German voices. Close maybe 40 meters ahead. Carter lowered his periscope, adjusting focus. Through the fog, he saw silhouettes crossing a forest path. 10, maybe 12 infantrymen carrying rifles and crates of ammunition. Their breath steamed in the cold. They weren't searching, they were moving supplies. An opportunity and a danger. If the Germans spotted tracks in the snow, they'd know Sherman was nearby. And a Sherman isolated in woods meant one thing to them: an easy prize. Carter breathed out slowly. "We wait. Let them pass." The enemy column marched by, unaware of how close they were to 5 Americans holding their breath inside a steel giant. Only when the last soldier disappeared into the trees did Carter give the signal to move again. But fate wasn't going to give them a quiet path. 2 minutes later, Beck tapped the turret wall sharply. Movement left. 3 German scouts with snow capes moving through the trees. One stopped, knelt, and touched something on the ground. Their tracks. "Daniels," Carter whispered, "reverse now." The tank backed up, but the snow-covered ground betrayed them. The scouts suddenly snapped their heads toward the sound. One shouted. Another raised a flare pistol. Before the flare could fire, Carter made the call. "Gunner Heatree, line fire." Beck squeezed the trigger. The 75mm gun thundered, echoing through the woods. The shell struck behind the scouts, blasting snow and splinters into a violent cloud. 1 German fell instantly. The others scattered, shouting for support. "Drive," Carter ordered. "We're blown." The Sherman surged forward. Branches whipped against the hull. Snow churned beneath the treads. Behind them, Beck saw figures moving, German infantry chasing, rifles raised, shouting directions. If they got to a radio operator, a Pak-40 would be on the road in minutes. And then they heard it. A long, distant metallic clank. Beck's blood ran cold. That's not infantry, that's tracks. A Panzer. Daniels gunned the engine, but the forest narrowed into a funnel of trees and rocks. They could only go forward. They had no idea where the Panzer was or whether it was cutting them off. Carter forced himself to stay calm. We find cover. A ravine, a ditch, anything. At 13:12, they spotted a break in the ground, a shallow depression. Daniels steered the tank into it, lowering their profile. They shut off the engine. Silence fell like a suffocating blanket. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the turret. Then the sound grew louder. A Panzer may be a mark if moving slowly across the ridge above them. Its engine rumbled like a monster breathing. Beck could hear the turret gears whining faintly as it scanned the woods. If it spotted them first, the Sherman wouldn't survive the first shot. Carter held his breath. Ortiz held still, hands frozen on an app shell. Daniels gripped the controls so hard his knuckles turned white. The Panzer crawled past 20 meters above them, oblivious. No one moved until the sound faded to nothing. Only then did Carter exhale. "We're not staying here," he said. "They'll follow the scouts' footprints straight to this ravine." We moved before they circled back. The crew restarted the engine quietly, carefully. Snow muffled most of the noise. They pushed deeper south, weaving unpredictably to avoid leaving a clear trail. But the Ardennes was full of traps. At 14:05, they encountered a destroyed convoy. Burned out American trucks, strewn ammunition crates, bodies half buried under snow. It was a scene of chaos, evidence that the Germans had smashed through this sector. Earlier that morning, the path ahead was blocked by wreckage. To the left a steep slope, to the right dense trees. Carter chose the slope. The Sherman strained, treads slipping, engine roaring. Snow and ice kicked up in sheets. The tank groaned as it climbed the uneven terrain, but at last it crested the ridge. What they saw on the other side made their stomachs drop. A German supply camp. Dozens of soldiers, medical tents, fuel drums, VHICLES lined in rows, and worse, a Pak-40 anti-tank gun sitting in the open pointed toward the road they had just escaped. The Sherman froze at the ridge line like a deer caught in headlights. One German soldier spotted the silhouette, his eyes widened. "Panzer!" he screamed, mistaking the Sherman for German armor. Chaos erupted. Carter reacted instantly. Back. Daniels reversed the tank as Beck swung the turret. Before the enemy crew could rotate the pack gun, Beck fired an E-shell. The explosion tore through the supply area, sending fuel drums into flames. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Tracer rounds sliced the air. Bullets pinged against the Sherman's hull. Snow exploded in bursts. German soldiers scrambled everywhere, shouting orders. Second shell. Carter yelled. Ortiz slammed another. He rounded into the breach. Beck fired again. Another blast tore through the tents, but they couldn't stay. They were outnumbered 50-1. Daniels backed the tank down the hill so fast the hull rattled violently. As soon as the slope leveled, Carter shouted, "Hard right," into the forest. The Sherman disappeared into the trees just as the Germans tried to reposition the pack gun. The tank shook violently from the rough terrain. Branches snapped against the turret. Snow streaked across the vision blocks. Sir Howell said quietly, "We're not just lost. We're surrounded." Carter stared through the periscope at the flames rising behind them. "No," he said. "Surrounded means you can't move. We can move. As long as we move, we survive." It was bravado, but it kept the crew steady. At 16 o'clock, the light began to fade. Night came early in the Ardennes. Daniels slowed the tank to a crawl. Visibility was collapsing. German patrols would be harder to spot, and the cold was worsening. Frost crept along the tank's interior. Beck rubbed his hands, staring at the empty woods. "They'll come for us tonight." Carter nodded. "Then we don't stop. We keep moving until we find friendlies." "Commander," Howell whispered, listening to the static. "I think I'm hearing something. Faint. American, maybe?" Carter leaned forward. "Which direction?" Howell adjusted the dial carefully. The signal was weak, but it was there just enough to give hope. "East-southeast," Howell said. "Maybe 3. For miles. Daniels tightened his grip on the controls. Carter looked at his crew, 5 men isolated in a steel box in a frozen forest. "Then that's where we go," he said. "If there's a chance in hell of getting back, we take it." The Sherman turned toward the faint signal. Behind them, far in the darkness of the woods, German voices echoed. They were hunting something, and they knew exactly what. The last moving American tank. Dusk fell over the Ardennes like a closing fist. The forest grew darker, sharper, more threatening with every minute. The Sherman moved slowly through the narrowing trees, its engine muffled by the thick blanket of snow. Inside, the crew felt the temperature dropping. Frost gathered on the interior metal. Breath misted in the air, and every touch of exposed skin stung like ice. Daniels kept the tank at a steady crawl, headlights off, relying on moonlight and instinct. The forest path twisted unpredictably, climbing over roots and rocks, then plunging into shallow ravines that felt like traps. Each bump rattled the hull and sent vibrations through the crew's bones. Howell leaned close to the radio, trying to hold onto the faint signal. It faded in and out like a dying heartbeat. "Still nothing clear," he muttered. "But the Americans are out there, somewhere." Carter stared through the periscope, eyes scanning every inch of shadow. "We keep moving. If the Germans get armor onto these roads before we're out, we're finished." For the next hour, they moved in silence broken only by the churn of treads and the soft clink of shells. Shifting in storage racks, the isolation began to feel crushing. The forest was enormous, endless, and filled with enemies who knew the land far better than they did. At 1740, Beck stiffened. "Commander, stop." Daniels froze the tank. Ahead, barely visible in the gloom, something glinted. A tripwire, just above the snow. Daniels whispered. They mined the path. Carter scanned the edges. German sappers had placed charges among the trees, concealed under branches and snow. Passing through would trigger an explosion that would tear the Sherman apart. They reversed carefully, backing into deeper woods. But the forest was tightening around them. Terrain sloped sharply. Fallen trees blocked paths, and every direction felt like a funnel leading to an ambush. At 1810, the first sound came. A distant whistle. Then another. Beck's face paled. They're signaling. German patrols were closing in. They were hunting not a platoon, not a column, just one tank. And that made it easier for them. The forest belonged to them. Carter gave the order. "We move east. No stops. No hesitation." The tank surged forward, weaving between trees. Branches snapped loudly in the dark. Behind them, shouts echoed, dozens of them. The Germans were spreading out. Howell's radio crackled suddenly, a burst of static followed by a faint American voice. "Harry 1, fallback, repeat, fallback 2. The signal collapsed, but it was enough. An American unit was somewhere east. If they could reach them, the crew might live long enough to warn that the forest was crawling with German patrols. At 1840, the forest thinned into a clearing. Daniels slowed instinctively. Tracks, fresh German tank tracks. Carter cursed under his breath. "They've got armor near us." The clearing was wide to wide for cover. Snow stretched in all directions, broken only by a few dead trees and the black outline of a frozen stream. Crossing it would expose them completely. Staying put would trap them. A faint rumble vibrated through the ground. Then the sound grew. Daniels whispered, "Panzer." Beck gripped the turret controls, lowering the gun. A Markov emerged on the far side of the clearing, headlight slits glowing like the eyes of a predator. Its turret swept left, then right, scanning the tree line. Daniels held his breath. Carter spoke quietly. "We move along the stream, slowly. If we fire, they'll hear us for a mile." The Sherman inched forward, treads cracking thin ice. The Markov paused, turret turning directly toward the sound. Time froze, then shouting erupted behind the German tank quarters, footsteps, metallic clanging. Soldiers were assembling nearby. The Markov turned away. "Go," Carter murmured. "Go now." They moved along the stream, disappearing into another wall of trees just as the Markov lumbered forward into the clearing. At 19 o'clock, darkness consumed the forest fully. They killed the engine and waited. Only breathing and the settling of snow broke the silence. Suddenly an explosion. Far behind them, Ortiz whispered, "Did they find our tracks?" Carter didn't answer, but they all knew the truth. The Germans were closing the net. Daniels restarted the engine and pushed the Sherman uphill toward toward higher ground. The climb was brutal. The treads slipped, the hull tilted dangerously, and branches scraped against the turret-like claws. At the top, they saw lights through the fog flickering, irregular, not flashlights but flames. A German camp. Close. Voices floated through the cold air, laughter, orders, the clatter of weapons. Carter pulled the periscope back. We stay low, circle around them, but the forest narrowed again. The camp stretched wider than expected, tents and trucks scattered across the slope. To the right was a cliff, to the left another minefield. The only path was down the center, dangerously close to the German fires. They had no choice. The Sherman crawled forward at the slowest possible speed. Every crack of a twig felt like a cannon blast. German soldiers walked between tents. A group gathered around a fuel drum fire, passing cigarettes. One man stepped dangerously close to the tank's path. Daniels held the tank perfectly still, barely breathing. The German soldier turned, then walked away. Only when the tank reached the far edge of the camp did Carter whisper, "Keep going." They descended into a ravine, engine straining. The path was slake, the ground uneven, but the ravine offered cover the forest didn't. Then the ravine opened into a narrow road barely wide enough for a tank. Daniels hesitated. "Commander tracks. American." Carter's heart jumped. "Friendly armor?" "No," Daniels said softly. "Look at the snow. These tracks are old. Frozen." They followed the road until the proof became undeniable. A destroyed Sherman lay sideways in the ditch, turret blown clean off, hull charred black. The snow around it was stained dark where bodies had fallen earlier that week. The Germans had covered them with branches. Beck looked at the burnt wreck. "That could have been us." Carter didn't reply. The tank moved on. At 21:15, Howell picked up a clearer signal. "This is Baker to fallback point at coordinates." Static swallowed the rest. But Carter recognized the grid pattern. "We're close. 2, maybe 3 miles. A mile for a tank in daylight was nothing. At night, in a forest full of enemies, it was eternity." They pressed forward. Then the forest shook. Gunfire erupted somewhere ahead, distant but intense. Flashes lit the sky. Artillery boomed. It wasn't aimed at them, someone else was fighting. "The line," Carter said. "The front line is ahead." But that meant crossing exactly where the Germans were attacking. At 22 o'clock, the Sherman reached the base of a long hill. Beyond it lay the American fallback point. They could hear rifle fire, machine guns, officers shouting in English. Hope surged through the crew. Then a flare burst overhead. "Green. Sherman." Daniels froze the tank. Voices shouted from the hilltop. Germans had taken the ridge ahead. Beck raised the gun. "Commander, no," Carter said. "Not yet." The flare revealed everything for one terrible moment: the slope, the trees, the German silhouettes moving into defensive positions. They had to break through here or die in the forest. Carter made his decision. Daniels full throttle. "We're charging the hill." The engine roared. The Sherman surged forward. German voices screamed in shock. Beck fired the first shell. The lone tank began its climb into enemy fire. The Sherman roared up the frozen slope, treads tearing through ice and roots. German voices erupted in panic as the tank burst from the tree line like a charging beast. Tracer fire streaked across the hull, ricocheting off steel plates. Daniels hunched forward, gripping the controls so tightly his knuckles went white. The tank lurched violently over rocks, its engine howling at full power. Beck swung the turret left. A German machine gun nest opened fire, sparks dancing across the glacis plate. He fired a high-explosive shell. The explosion lit the ridge, sending men scattering. Snow and dirt rained down on the turret roof. Carter braced himself. "Keep pushing. Don't stop for anything." Daniels kept the throttle slammed forward. The Sherman's nose lifted as it hit the steepest part of the hill. The engine groaned, treads slipping then catching. The tank clawed upward. More fire poured down from the ridgeline. Rifles, machine guns, Panzerfausts preparing to fire. A German soldier stepped onto the slope. Panzerfaust raised. Beck fired before he could aim. The shell detonated at his feet, throwing him backward in a spray of snow. Another team rushed forward from the right. Ortiz leaned into the 50 cal on the commander's hatch, firing along. Ringing burst that cut them down. At 20 meters from the crest, the hillside leveled briefly. Daniels used it to gain speed. The Sherman thundered forward, crushing abandoned crates, smashing through branches. Grenades exploded against the hull, painful but not fatal. fatal. Then came the Panzerfaust that almost ended everything. From a bunker sled on the left, a German fired at point-blank range. The rocket hissed across the slope, striking the Sherman low on the side armor. The blast rocked the tank so violently that Howell was thrown from his seat. Smoke filled the interior. Warning lights flickered. Daniels yelled, "We're hit but she's still rolling." Carter didn't hesitate. "Forget the flank. Take the ridge." They pushed upward through thick smoke. The German bunker that fired the Panzerfaust loomed ahead. Beck loaded and a shell fired and turned the bunker into a collapsing cloud of timber and stone. The path opened. The Sherman climbed the final stretch and burst onto the ridge. The German line shattered at the sight of a lone American tank erupting from the darkness. Some broke and ran downhill, others tried to regroup, shouting orders that dissolved under the roar of the engine. Ahead, through drifting smoke, Carter saw it. American positions, sandbags, helmet silhouettes, muzzle flashes firing downhill past the Sherman. They had made it, but the Germans were not done. Mortars thumped behind the ridge. Shells fell around the Sherman, carving holes in the snow. Infantry regrouped nearby, preparing a counterattack. If they pushed now, they could overrun the ridge before the Americans solidified their line. Carter shouted through the turret, "We're not out yet. Pivot right, fire on their staging line." Daniels swung the tank east, exposing the turret to every shot on the hillside. Beck fired shell after shell into the massing infantry. Snow geysers erupted, silhouettes scattered, officers shouted in panic. Ortiz swept the slope with the 50 cal brass casings bouncing off the turret roof. A mortar round struck near the left tread. The tank jolted violently. The left side sagged, damaged but still moving. Daniels compensated, grinding the hull toward firmer ground. Then, finally, American rifles joined in. A platoon rose from foxholes and opened fire downhill. A machine gun team dragged their tripod into place and stitched the slope with coordinated bursts. The German counterattack collapsed. Those who survived fled back into the forest, disappearing into darkness as quickly as they had come. The ridge fell quiet except for ringing ears, drifting smoke, and the dull groan of the Sherman's strained engine. For the first time in hours, no bullets flew. Carter slumped back, breathing hard. Daniels shut the engine to a low idle. Beck leaned against the turret wall, exhausted. Ortiz sat with his back to the hatch, staring into the night sky. American soldiers approached cautiously, disbelief on their faces. One sergeant stared at the battered Sherman and shook his head. "You came from the North Woods. That place is crawling with Krauts." Carter answered simply, voice hoarse, "We were the last tank in our column. We weren't dying out there." The sergeant nodded slowly, respect dawning. "You boys just saved this position. If they'd taken that ridge, the whole line would have folded." The Sherman crew exchanged tired glances. They had crossed miles of forest, minefields, patrols, tanks, and ambushes. A lone survivor of a larger force crawling through enemy territory with one goal: reach friendly lines. Warn them, hold the ridge. They had done it. The ridge belonged to the Americans, and the German push died on its slopes that night. The last surviving tank sat smoking in the snow-scarred, battered, half-crippled yet undefeated, a symbol of the stubborn, desperate will of the men who refused to quit, even when the war closed around them from every direction.